This is Gareth Southgate, and this is the Three Lions podcast.
Hello there and welcome to the Three Lions podcast. My name is Russell Osborne and this is an independent England football supporters podcast. I hope I find you well, and we are back with another in our England managers series. As I'm sure you're aware, we have been looking at the previous managers of our senior men's team and speaking who have done the work, researching them and writing about them. You may remember we began with Walter Winterbottom, we moved to Alf Ramsey, Don Revie, Ron Greenwood, and most recently, Bobby Robson, where I spoke with David Hartrick. All those previous episodes can be found at your podcast provider of choice, or of course, threelionspodcast.com. Now, you would think that Graham Taylor would be next, and under normal circumstances, you'd be right. And I'm doing the research on that one. It will come soon. But before that, there is someone else who has cropped up who I think has an important role to play in the whole manager's story, the managerial story. The good people at Pitch Publishing have connected me with David Tossell, who has written a biography on Don Howe, of course, Bobby Robson's right-hand man and very good friend. So it's all tied in quite nicely. So David, welcome along.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're more than welcome. When this book came my way, I kind of thought it was a little bit of a Star Wars spin-off in a strange way. I do like my Star Wars in the fact that this, whilst Don Howe was never an England manager, he had another part of the story that Rogue One had to Star Wars. I don't know if I'm speaking to someone who's not familiar with Star Wars, but that was just my immediate take on it.
No, don't worry. I get the analogy. No problem.
But yes, the story of Don Howe, English football's greatest coach, the hero in the shadows. As I say, I've got the book in front of me. There he is on the front wearing his England jacket. How did this come about? Let's start at the beginning.
I've written quite a few books about people from that era, players, coaches, managers, people like Alan Ball and Jimmy Greaves and Malcolm Allison. Written quite a bit about Arsenal in the early 70s. Wrote a book about the double team. Did a biography of Bertie Mee. So Don Howe had been a figure in a lot of those books. And sort of looking around for the next subject, it just felt to me that Don Howe was an important figure in English football, who doesn't always get the credit he deserves, and sometimes amongst those people who are sort of aware of him, maybe gets a bit of a raw deal in that he's, over the years, I guess, been sort of saddled with a bit of a dour image, both in terms of personality and sort of the nature of the football that some of his teams have played, which I'm sure we'll come to later. So it felt like it was sort of time to kind of examine his career, potentially put the record straight a little bit, and just sort of outline what an important figure he's been in English football over, a very long period of time. And obviously, as it relates to the England team, hugely important in that he was there at the side of three different England managers in World Cup semi-finals and sort of, major tournaments. And I guess you could say he was probably the one sort of specialist English coach in English football history, really. I mean, most England managers now, as we know, sort of bring in their own right-hand man, someone who they've worked with at club level. You think of people like, Ray Lewington working with Roy Hodgson and Sammy Lee with Sam Allardyce and Derek Fazackerley with Kevin Keegan and people like that. Whereas Don Howe was the one guy that England managers would turn to and say, right, we need you. There was a great quote from the Times in around 1996 that said, Don Howe, he never gets the England job, but he comes with the job. And I think that sort of sums up quite nicely his importance to the England team.
Yes. Well, you mentioned that many of the books that you've written. And am I right in saying that in the research that you've done for some of those books, you actually met and sort of communicated with Don?
Yeah, I spoke to Don Howe a few times. First of all, when I wrote the book about the Arsenal double team, he was great, giving me an insight into what made that team so good and his role in that. Then also spoke to him again in a little bit more detail when I did a biography of Bertie Mee. And then he's cropped up in other books. A biography I did of Malcolm Allison. Don Howe was an interesting figure in that he and Allison were kind of part of the first wave of real English coaches, if you like. I mean, coaching wasn't really a thing until sort of the 1950s, really. Walter Winterbottom, who you mentioned it earlier, as part of his role as England manager, was also responsible for the whole sort of coaching setup in English football and helped get a lot of people onto that pathway and helped make a lot of people see that coaching actually had a large part to play in English football. And Malcolm Allison, and then just sort of behind him, Don Howe, were sort of amongst the first people to really take that on and see the importance it had in the English game itself, and then also to see it as a sort of real viable career path. So so he was part of the Malcolm Allison story, and has sort of cropped up in various other sort of things as well along the way. So as I say, he is someone who's a very important part of English football. There's a the website, a guy sort of looks at English footballer autobiographies, and he's come up with a thing called the Don Howe rule, which is where it's kind of almost obligatory for anyone who's played football in the last 40 years to sort of say what a great coach Don Howe was. So he has sort of crossed across many people's life stories, if you like. Yeah,
I picked up on that throughout the book. There's a lot of positive quotes from various players. What do you think he would have thought to having a book written about his story from your experience with him?
I don't think he would have really seen what the value was and why someone would be interested in chronicling what he'd done in football. I guess he saw it as a job of work. He didn't have a big ego. He didn't. He wasn't one of these people who kind of would ever say, right, put your medals on the table, show me what you've won. He just enjoyed the job for the job's sake, and that's why throughout his career he ended up working at a lot of varied outposts, including some non-league teams who just went to him and wanted some help, and so he would kind of help them out. When he started working with Terry Venables as the New England manager at the end of '93, Don Howe at that time was working with Newbury Town in the sort of the Division 2 of the old Isthmian League, just because someone had come to him and said, we'd like your help. And he said, yeah, fine, I'll do it. He enjoyed coaching. He enjoyed working with players. He enjoyed helping people improve their own game. And he saw himself as a jobbing football coach. Of course, he loved the glory. He loved winning prizes as anyone would, but it wasn't necessarily the motivation for his career in the sense of what he could get out of it in terms of his own profile. He just loved the work. Yeah. And so I think if someone had said to him, right, I'm going to write a book about you, his reaction would have been, don't waste your time. There isn't a story there.
Wow, far from it. It's a very enjoyable story. But let's start at the beginning. He was born in Wolverhampton, 12th of October, 1935, at a period of time when Wolves were quite a team. He got to signing on age, where he signed on with West Bromwich Albion, where he went on to spend, I think, the best part of 12 years as a player there. Moved to Arsenal for a couple of years, and then in that period of time won himself 23 England caps within the space of 2 years, between sort of 57 and 59 as a right back. What was his sort of playing career sort of defined by?
Yeah, it's interesting. His in some ways his playing career has kind of been forgotten by what he's done as a coach. But he was a very accomplished fullback, very much a fullback more in the modern style. I mean, right backs in the sort of late 40s and early 50s were almost judged by how far they could kick the winger into the stands. They weren't expected to play a lot of football. It was just, don't let the winger get past you. But Don Howe was one of the earlier people to actually try and play a bit of football, if you like. He was a disciple or a fan, if you like, of Alf Ramsey, who was again, a bit more of a footballing right back than a lot of people had been used to seeing at that time. So he saw himself as someone who could play a bit of football. He liked to overlap. He liked to attack. He developed very good partnerships and relationships with people who played in front of him. So at West Brom, for example, he became very good friends, as you mentioned, with Bobby Robson, but they meshed very well. As a unit, Robson sort of playing at right half and Don Howe at right back, created quite a partnership and were responsible for a lot of the creativity in West Brom's team. So he certainly wasn't just a stopper type fullback. He was acknowledged as being a good footballer as well. And won 23 England caps, as you say, on the trot. Finally, sort of losing his place to Jimmy Armfield, who I guess was another sort of fullback in that same mould, someone who could play a bit of football. So during the course of that, he played in the 1958 World Cup finals and just had a bit of a loss of form after the 58 World Cup, which cost him his place and never got it back, although he was a squad member in 62. But by that time, he was starting to see a potential future in coaching, and he saw his involvement in the 62 World Cup as much more of a learning experience and a chance to go and watch international football at the highest level in a different environment than he saw it as a chance to add to his number of England caps.
Yeah. The way he sort of looked at the game was quite interesting in the fact you mentioned there when he sort of his career, where he fell out of form in part of his early career and thought to himself, actually, if this ends my career, what else do I know? And before, I guess, the whole managerial or coaching side of things came to him, he became a car salesman for 5 months and he had a stint selling, was it machine tools?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, England, even an England player of that era knew that he was never going to earn enough money to live off. Everyone had to have one eye at some point on what they did after their football career. So I guess that the more successful players who had a little bit of money behind them, the thing was to kind of open your own business. You had a lot of people buying in news agents or opening pubs or whatever. Don, as you say, went into car salesmanship for a while and then sold machine tools. It was only sort of quite late in his career that he saw that coaching was actually a way of staying in the game. Originally, he'd kind of gone on coaching courses because he felt it would give him a greater appreciation of football and would actually help him as a player. It wasn't necessarily with a view to a future career. But as time went on, that's how it developed. And that is what he eventually realised was his post-playing path, if you like. And as things worked out at Arsenal with suffering a very badly broken leg not long after he went there, it ended up that he had a chance to go into it a little bit earlier than he would have planned. Yeah,
it was Bertie Mee who was manager of Arsenal there who suggested he manage their reserves.
Yes, I mean he broke his leg in a very sort of bad collision. One of those ones where other players on the field said you could hear the crack over the sound of the crowd all around the stadium. And so even though he did play the odd game after that, it was clear that this was career ending. Bertie Mee, the big strength of Bertie Mee was that he was very good at identifying people around him who could do a good job. Bertie Mee was a physiotherapist by trade, had played a little bit of professional football, was a very good organiser, but was never going to be one to do the coaching himself. So he'd identified Dave Sexton as his first team coach. he knew that Don Howe was interested in that side of things. So once Don wasn't able to play anymore, his idea was that he coached the reserve team, and that would sort of get him on that coaching pathway. As it turned out, he only did that for a year because Dave Sexton then went off to manage Chelsea. And that gave him a chance to step up again, probably more quickly than he might have been anticipating, and became the Arsenal first team coach. The Arsenal players had loved Dave Sexton. He'd been a real sort of revelation to them. And Don Howe had to sort of fight a little bit to make them realise that, you know, he had something to offer as well. And had a sort of famous blow up with the players at a practice section where he said, "Look, you know, come on, Dave Sexton's gone. I'm in charge now. You've got to do it for me." And from then on, never really looked back.
That's right. Yeah, that was on the training pitch where I read that. Yeah, he thought, right, it's time I put my foot down and sort of establish myself here. But I think once he got to sort of that sort of higher position at Arsenal, he realised that there was a lot more that came with it as sort of coach come manager, and it wasn't his way of, or it wasn't what he wanted to do.
Yeah, I think one of the big conundrums of Don Howe's career as a whole, if you like, is how someone who could be so successful as a coach at so many different clubs and in so many sort of different circumstances could not have that same success as a manager. And I think it was something that he felt he had to have a go at some point. So after winning the double with Arsenal, he had the chance to go and manage West Brom. But I think he probably, at moments when he was being most honest with himself, would realise that it wasn't necessarily something he was cut out for. He didn't want to do the administration. He didn't want to do the PR and press stuff that he'd seen sort of Bertie Mee have to do at Arsenal. That was why Bertie and Don worked so well together. You know, Bertie had no aspirations to be a great coach. He was, as I said earlier, he was a very good organizer and administrator, would do the sort of the PR stuff and deal with the board and everything else that went with that, and left Don Howe to get on with the coaching. When Don Howe became a manager and had to do more of that himself, it just wasn't something that he was necessarily cut out to do, didn't want to do. It was a chore that I guess he had to do. He didn't want to go and sort of glad hand with the board of directors. He just wanted to be on the training pitch. And that's why things worked so well with Don Howe and sort of later other people that he worked with, and why maybe it wasn't so successful when he was his own man at West Brom and sort of later at Arsenal and a couple of other places. He just appeared to be cut out and born to be a number two. Yeah,
it seems that he was almost torn between two clubs, West Brom and Arsenal, but he had such an influence on both. When he was at West Brom, just as his sort of time was coming to an end there, he was the man who basically brought former England captain Brian Robson into the fold there, who Brian Robson himself said he could see what Don Howe was all about.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, that maybe the greatest legacy that Don Howe had as West Brom manager was the fact that he was the one who signed Brian Robson to a sort of full-time professional contract. And and Robson said in his own autobiography that that what a great influence Don Howe had been on him, and was again later on when he sort of worked under him as an England player and alongside him as an England coach. Again, one of those players that has nothing but a huge amount of respect for him. So the West Brom thing didn't work out very well, but if nothing else, it got Brian Robson into the fold, and everyone knows what that did, both for Robson himself and for West Brom and for English football, I guess.
That's right. And so his time at West Brom came to an end, and he returned to Arsenal to work with then Arsenal manager Terry Neal, where between them they had sort of one of the most sort of successful periods that Arsenal have had, sort of pre-Wenger, where they had 3 FA Cup finals, they had European finals. it was quite a dynamic duo between the pair of them.
It was, and very different to what had gone before. I mean, as I said earlier, the big sort of stick that people beat Don Howe with when they look at his career and the teams was the fact that the teams that he was in charge of and developed weren't necessarily playing the most the beautiful of football.
Yeah,
and that certainly was true for the Arsenal double team of '71. They did extremely well. And if you speak to a lot of players, they will tell you that they were more innovative and technically proficient, if you like, than a lot of people gave them credit for. But they certainly weren't playing the kind of football that Arsenal under Arsene Wenger would play.
No.
So when he teamed up with Terry Neal, they had that 3-year period where they got to a lot of finals, had a lot of success in cup tournaments, and were doing it in a very different style. He had people like Liam Brady, Graham Ricks, Alan Hudson for a while. Malcolm McDonald was, a hugely exciting forward. They had the tools to play the kind of game that he hadn't had, if you like, under Bertie Mee. When you've got players like Brady and Ricks, it doesn't make sense to play a direct game and sort of lump the ball forward to the front two. You want to get those people in the game. And Don Howe was pragmatic more than anything else. He would play whatever way he felt gave his team the best chance of victory. And if you've got people like Brady and Ricks in the team, the best chance is to get the ball to their feet and let them play. Yeah. And that was what he did. What he did do also, though, is he told people like Liam Brady that you had to earn the right to play. You couldn't just get the ball and start dribbling it around and suddenly success would come. You had to think about the game. You had to work hard at it. And so once he got all those sort of things moving in the right direction, and I can say this as an Arsenal fan who was standing on the North Bank in that period, it was some of the most exciting football that Arsenal fans had seen for many, many years. It was a joy to watch. In the end, they were, in a sense, a little bit of a victim of their own success in that certainly in that 1979-80 season where they got to 2 finals, they were just basically wiped out by the end of it. They had to play so many games that they just ran out of steam in the end and lost 2 finals in the space of 4 days in the FA Cup and the Cup Winners' Cup. And so the team probably never quite got the trophies that maybe they thought they should have deserved. But certainly, if you ask any Arsenal fan of that period, they would have nothing but sort of fond memories of the football they saw.
Yeah. Now, is it right that he would often work wherever he went sort of without a contract?
Yeah, he did that at quite a few places, either as manager and coach. He would kind of do a sort of rolling contract, basically. He wasn't one for worrying about his own status, if you like, his own employment status. He just wanted to get on and work with the players, and the other stuff would kind of take care of itself.
Right.
And so that was kind of one of the products of that. You're right, was that he often didn't work with a contract. It meant that he was kind of open to a lot of speculation about what he might do with his career, because people knew he didn't have a long-term contract. So therefore, when some opportunities came up, it might be that Don Howe's name would come up. I mean, when he was coaching England under Ron Greenwood in the early 80s, because he didn't have a contract at Arsenal, some of the players wondered if he had a long-term future at Arsenal, whether he was going to suddenly ditch them and go off and work full-time with England, because his contract would allow him to do that. Eventually, he did sign a contract with Arsenal that sort of made that a little bit more secure and took some of that doubt away from the players. But you're right. He wasn't one to worry too much about his contract status. He just wanted to get on with the job.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. Now, we said obviously there was maybe torn between both West Brom and Arsenal, but he would have England at heart as well. Reading the book, there was a part whilst he was at Arsenal, he came into conflict with Bertie Mee, the manager, who had wanted Peter Storey and Bob McNabb to withdraw from an England team at the time. And Howe insisted to him, you can't ask them to drop out of the England side, which is I don't think it's something you would hear these days.
Especially not in the heat of a league title battle, which is what it was at the time. I think it reflects a couple of things. It reflects the way that Don Howe thought about the England team, and it also, I guess, reflects the time as well, and the age where, I guess, playing for England for a player was maybe seen as more of an honour than it is today, perhaps by some people. Certainly, Don looked at that from a player's perspective rather than the coach's perspective, and he knew that he felt that it would be unfair to the players to force them to pull out of playing for England because there was a clash of league games. I guess the other thing it reflects was the period when football didn't just stop for international games. That they all had to be fitted into the calendar when and however they could be, and if there'd been some postponements in the league programme and games had to be played in the same week as international games, then players and clubs did have to choose which was going to be their priority. And all credit to Don from looking at it from an England perspective, he felt it was more important for those Arsenal players to play for England rather than to play in a league game.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to England. When the Don Revie period, it, as we know, came to an acrimonious end. Ron Greenwood was appointed, and one of his visions was to bring back the England youth sides, of which Bobby Robson was appointed as the England B manager. And with that, he appointed Don as his assistant, which, I mean, that friendship goes back way before then, but it shows it moving forwards.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was actually Ron Greenwood himself who'd said, like, Bobby Robson and Don Howe should work together at the B team. He had Dave Sexton and Terry Venables working the under-21s, and sort of infamously had Brian Clough and Peter Taylor in charge for a while of the youth team, which, surprise, surprise, didn't really work out. But it was an interesting way of approaching things. I mean, Ron Greenwood was someone who realised that there was an awful lot of clever thinking around English football, and why not get those people involved in the England team? So, Don was given a role at the B team. He also was given a role sort of on the senior team coaching staff as well. And when Ron Greenwood went out to watch the 1978 World Cup finals, he asked Don Howe to go out with him as well as part of that group. So Don Howe fairly quickly became part of Ron Greenwood's inner circle. And he eventually asked him to, well, not eventually, but quite quickly asked him to start working with the first team. And then with the illness and then sort of tragic early death of Bill Taylor, who was officially the England team coach in 81, Don sort of stepped up and took over that mantle.
And that was whilst he was still technically Arsenal's coach as well, wasn't it?
Correct, yes. And Don never saw that as a conflict. He always felt that was something that he could do, and he felt Don was such a student of the game that he saw that working with England and working with lots of different players could actually help him as a coach, and I guess then help whichever club he was with. As you say, at that time, Arsenal. He would quiz people like Viv Anderson and Tony Woodcock about what Brian Clough was doing at Forest. He would ask people what was going on at their clubs. He wanted to know all the time what other things were being thought of, what other methods were out there that he could use and adopt. So he saw that as an opportunity to expand his knowledge of the game and would actually be a help to him at his club rather than creating any kind of conflict of interest.
Yeah. They went to the World Cup in 82 in Spain. England went there, didn't lose a game, but unfortunately came home in the second round, wasn't it? But there was a lot of talk at the time that maybe Don was having a little more influence over the team than actually Ron Greenwood, the manager, was.
Yeah, and that all came to a head in the first game of the second phase. England had won all three games in their group and got into the the second round, which some people may remember was sort of 4 groups of 3, with the winner of each going into the semi-finals. England were grouped with Germany, West Germany, and Spain. And first game in the group drew 0-0 with West Germany. And even though West Germany went on to be in the final, that they wasn't the best West German team anyone had ever seen. And the feeling was that England in that match, had they been a little bit more adventurous, could have beaten them rather than drawing 0-0. And so a lot of the TV pundits and particularly ITV, who covered the game live, John Bond and Mick Shannon on their panel were saying, look, this doesn't look like a Ron Greenwood team. John Bond had been a teammate of Ron Greenwood's and had played under him at West Ham. And he said, that is not the Ron Greenwood football I know. This was a Don Howe performance. And it's to the detriment of the England team that they are playing that way. And it became quite a debate. Ron Greenwood had to sort of step in and defend Don. And then it came to the next game, England's sort of final game of the tournament, where they needed to beat Spain 2-0. Keegan and Brooking had both been injured throughout the tournament. Both felt they were fit, and both felt that Don Howe had quite a big role in persuading Ron Greenwood that it would be too much of a gamble to put them in to play in that game. Keegan and Brooking both felt a gamble was exactly what was needed at that time, because they needed to win by 2 goals to get into the semi-finals. And so, it was kind of a nothing to lose scenario. And I think both came away from that feeling that Don had exerted a little bit too much of an influence, both on team selection and the way that they played throughout the finals. But, at the end of the day, you look at it, England went through a World Cup finals unbeaten, and the fact that they played that kind of solid football maybe is what got them as far as they did. So it's one of those debates that still rages, if you like.
Yeah, I think there was a famous piece of footage at the time where, was it Jack Charlton, I think, who was working for possibly ITV, where he was interviewing both Greenwood and Howe, I think by the side of the pool, and it got a little bit sort of heated.
Yes, it did, because Jack Charlton was saying, well, why didn't you play this way? Why didn't you, particularly in the second half of the West Germany game, you could have pushed people like Graham Ricks and Steve Coppell a bit further forward, made sure that they were attacking a little bit more. And Don Howe turned around to him and said, look, we played exactly the same way we played against France, and we beat them 3-1. And we all know what a good team France turned out to be in that tournament. And, no one was criticising us then. And now, because things didn't quite go the same way, you're sort of turning around and criticising us. And I think also there was this underlying feeling that Jack Charlton, as someone who was a sort of a football manager and I guess past the fraternity, should have maybe have cut them a little bit more slack. And, Ron Greenwood at some point turns around to him and says, oh, you're turning into be a good journalist, Jack. And felt that he'd sort of almost crossed the divide and, hang on, you're meant to be one of us, not one of them. It does make for a very interesting piece of TV. It got quite a lot of play when Jack Charlton died. A lot of people were sort of posting that on social media and saying, here's a good clip to watch. So if people haven't seen it, it's certainly worth a look.
Yeah, certainly. So many players throughout the book who you've spoken to or picked up on quotes for just say, as a coach, how his training sessions were just so interesting, so varied, diverse. And it was almost, the fact is, because he knew that the players he had on the pitch in front of him, they all had a short attention span, really.
Yeah, and Don had grown up in an era where training was dull, to say the least. I mean, it would be running around the track or running up and down the steps of the stand, hoofing a ball down the field every now and again, and some days not even seeing a football. And Don realised that was not what was going to keep the attention of professional footballers. They needed to be stimulated. They needed to do exercises on the field that actually related to what they would be doing in the game. And so, you're right. All the players said that his sessions were very varied, always different, always interesting. Bob Harris, who was a journalist who worked very closely with Bobby Robson, said that he watched a lot of England training sessions, and he said, even as an observer, he found them fascinating to watch, never got bored with them. And I think that was, one of Don Howe's strengths, in that he did keep things interesting and he did keep people's attention.
So we've got England on the go. We've still got Arsenal on the go, because as 82 finished at the World Cup there, Ron Greenwood, he hung up his hat and said, no, I'm out. And Bobby Robson was to take control of England. And at sort of a similar time, I think was Terry Neal sacked from Arsenal, and then Don Howe became the caretaker manager, eventually becoming full-time manager. These are both running at the same time.
Yes, and again, I think it's the fact that Bobby Robson had such a close relationship with Don, trusted him, knew that there wouldn't be a conflict of interest. He was happy to keep Don as his assistant for England, even after Don had stepped up in 83 to become Arsenal manager, which, by its very nature means that it's a much greater commitment than just being coach. All the other things that we talked earlier about that you have to do as manager. But Don was adamant that he wanted to continue working with England. Bobby Robson, I think, would have loved to have had Don on the books as a full-time assistant manager. And it was a frustration to him that he never could. Interestingly, when I spoke to Don's son, Rob, he said that he doesn't think his dad would have actually wanted to have taken that role. He wouldn't have wanted to be a full-time assistant manager for England because it wouldn't have kept him occupied enough. Right. He would have missed the day-to-day contact with the players. So working day-to-day at Arsenal and then still having his interest in England was the perfect scenario for him. And as I say, Bobby, even though he couldn't get Don as full-time assistant, had no qualms about keeping him on, even when he was full-time Arsenal manager. Although by the time they got to the 86 World Cup, that was no longer the case, because it wasn't long before that Don was moved on as Arsenal manager, because things, as we said earlier, hadn't really worked out for him as manager.
Yeah. And that was a period of time when George Graham came in from Millwall to manage Arsenal. But just back to Bobby Robson, when he took control of England back then, that friendship had been there and it was blooming, and he speaks really highly of Don. He said his experience is invaluable, and there's a piece in the book where one word sums up Bobby Robson's relationship with Don Howe: brothers, that they were rock solid. And that was by journalist and author Bob Harris. And amazingly, he was never a full-time paid member of staff for England, was Don Howe. Apparently it was £200 a game rather than a £25,000 salary.
Yeah, I mean, that is the interesting thing about it. I mean, you think now of the kind of number of staff that an England team has, and the number of full-time staff and support staff and coaches in all different kind of roles. But Don was quite happy just to be doing it on that part-time basis. Bobby was happy to have him working on that basis, and it's seemed to work well for them, and certainly you look at the results that they achieved together, you can't argue with it, even though obviously Bobby Robson had various periods throughout his England career where the knives are out for him, and I think that's another strength that Bobby Robson saw in Don Howe, was that he was such a support to him when things did go badly, and when there were a lot of headlines doubting Robson's ability and sort of suitability as England manager. He always knew that Don Howe was right there beside him and gave him an awful lot of support.
Yeah, it was real true friendship between them. And let's say that period of sort of 86 was a quite a hard one, as well as sort of going forward for Bobby Robson as England manager as well. The '86 World Cup in Mexico, as we just mentioned, was a period of time where he would split from Arsenal. And we've mentioned that he liked to keep his training sessions all nice and varied, and the players really responded to that. He was quite vocal, though, in his training and his coaching, but he would still sort of take on comments from the players who was coaching, especially in '86 after the sort of disappointing opening two games. There was the defeat to Portugal and a draw with Morocco. He was quite open to what the players thought.
Yeah, I mean, Don was, as I said, was pretty open-minded, and he knew that he didn't know everything, which is, I think, is a great strength of anyone in any profession. So, yeah, they went into '86 World Cup, didn't get off to a very good start. Don had wanted England to play, as he did with a lot of his teams, a sort of quite a high pressing game. He wanted the forwards to be pressing the back four. It seems to become in recent years. It's become all the rage. You look at the way sort of Man City and Liverpool play, and it was the Gegen press, as they call it, and the front players pressurising the back four with the ball. But Don Howe had been doing that as long ago as the Arsenal double team. So he'd worked hard on getting the players fit when they got to Mexico. I think they were very surprised at how hard he pushed them in the early training sessions. Everyone thought that they would just sort of be eased into it because it was so hot. Don Howe had them out there for a couple of hours in the blazing heat, making sure that they were as fit as they could be. But after the first couple of results, and they had sort of a conversation about how they were going to approach the game against Poland, their third game, which they had to win to stay in the competition. And Glenn Hoddle was telling me that there was a lot of discussion saying, look, Don, we just need to maybe take our foot off the gas a little bit, not press quite so much, because we're going to burn ourselves out. We just need to ease back a little bit and find a compromise, which they did. They didn't abandon it completely, but they just sort of took their foot off the gas a little bit when it came to pressurising the opponent's back four when they had the ball. And that was the kind of thing he was able to do. He was able to take on other people's ideas, and obviously it worked out pretty well in beating Poland and then beating Paraguay in the last 16 and getting into the famous game against Argentina. So I think that definitely did make a difference.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to dwell too much on Argentina. We all know about that one. But the World Cup came to an end, and then he was out of a managerial coaching job in the domestic game. So apparently he took some time and went to Saudi Arabia.
Worked in Saudi Arabia, just sort of coaching at sort of, youth players. Apparently got an offer to be manager of the Saudi Arabian national team, which I think he thought about, decided that it wasn't the right thing for his family, and just sort of, came back and was watching games and really looking for something. And another one of his old football buddies, we talked about Bobby Robson, who he played with at West Brom, became friends with Terry Neal at Arsenal. And then another one, Bobby Gould, who became a good friend of his, even though Don Howe sort of basically kicked him out of Arsenal because he didn't feel he was good enough. Bobby Gould called him up and said, look, I'm manager of Bristol Rovers. I could do with a bit of help. Would you come and give me a hand? And, the famous quote from Bobby Gould, he said it was like asking Miss World for a date and her turning around and saying yes. He really wasn't expecting him to go and agree to work with him. But he did. He worked there for a couple of months, helped him out. And so when Bobby Gould then became manager of Wimbledon after Dave Bassett moved on in the summer of '87, Bobby called up Don Howe and said, look, do you fancy coming and helping out? Again, on a part-time basis to start with, thought it may just be for the summer program. They went on tour to Scandinavia and then came back and Don said, yeah, okay, I'll do it, become your full-time coach. And as anyone who remembers that period knows, went on and beat Liverpool in the FA Cup final, which, may have been one of Don's greatest coaching achievements. When you look at, the Wimbledon of that time, the crazy gang, no money, playing at Plough Lane in front of 5,000 and playing in the cup final against a Liverpool team that had won the league that year with what was considered to be one of the greatest of all Liverpool teams, Barnes and Beardsley in their pomp, been absolutely thrashing the pants off a lot of very good teams, and were given no hope of beating them in the final. But Don came up with a plan where they could neutralise John Barnes by moving Dennis Wise from the left, where he was Wimbledon's most creative player, to a position on the right where he was basically just going to help shut down John Barnes. And, it worked, and they won the game 1-0. And as I say, probably one of his finest coaching achievements.
One of the real FA Cup romance stories, that one that many of us will really remember. But I think it's safe to say when he did go to Wimbledon to start with and looked around Plough Lane and inevitably compared it to what he had at Arsenal and thought, hang on a minute, this isn't a particularly nice environment. But the one thing that really he did pick up on was their work ethic and being a coach, and he was obviously more than happy to be involved there.
Yeah, I mean, if someone was prepared to work hard, then Don had a lot of time for them, and he realised pretty quickly that what he was surrounded by wasn't the kind of facilities that he'd been used to at Arsenal and other places that he'd worked. But if the players were willing to put in the hard work, then it really didn't matter what the changing rooms were like or what the quality of the surface at the training ground was. What mattered was what he could get out of the players. And he saw the players as people he could work with and who would listen to him and that he could improve. I mean, he said he kind of felt he added an extra sort of 25% to that team. And that was enough to kind of help them achieve the success that they did. And it certainly was for a period of time until things started to get a little bit more out of hand and eventually kind of tired of the antics of the sort of the Vinnie Joneses of this world. It was a very happy period of time for him.
Yeah. Well, obviously it was the same period of time where England went to the European Championships of 1988 in West Germany. England fans will know it. It wasn't the best of times. England had a disaster of a tournament, but it would sort of lead to an unfortunate period of time for him where he shortly afterwards he had to have a triple heart bypass operation.
Yeah, I mean, Don had not, and I guess this is probably true of a lot of people involved in sort of coaching at any era, so involved in what they were doing, didn't spend an awful lot of time thinking about their own health, if you like, probably didn't eat very well, lots of late night meals on motorways and stuff like that. His family were telling me that he wasn't one to be thinking about looking after his health. Was a little bit overweight, hadn't had a healthy lifestyle, and suffered, as you say, suffered pains during and after the European Championships, and ended up having to have fairly major surgery. And the guys at Wimbledon were amazed at how quickly he was back on the training field. And again, that says a lot about Don's desire just to get out there and work. He didn't do it to prove that he was superhuman or anything. He just missed it. And as soon as he was back on the training field, he was running around, and people were saying, hang on, Don, take it easy. But, it didn't matter to him. He just wanted to get out there and work. And, certainly with Bobby Robson, as they looked to rebuild from the wreckage of that 88 towards the 1990 World Cup, but obviously felt there was a lot of work to do.
Yeah, but here, sort of in this sort of interim period of 88 and 90 and just shortly afterwards, was where he had a whole variety of other clubs he was coaching at. And you already mentioned Newbury Town right at the very beginning, but he had spells at Barnet, at QPR, Coventry as well, and Chelsea as well. So he was quite varied in his sort of teams that he was around at the time, while still being England coach alongside Bobby Robson getting ready for 1990.
Yeah, I mean, QPR fans have quite fond memories of the couple of years he had there as manager. He took over from Trevor Francis and was in charge for a couple of seasons. They were sort of mid-table, which, for QPR was probably about right. Played some good football, had some good players. People there like, Roy Wegerle, who speaks very highly of Don Howe and the freedom he gave him to play. I mean, again, another example of how, even though Don Howe was sort of saddled with this image of being a dour coach, he did like individual players in his team. The Charlie George, Liam Brady, Roy Wegerle to an extent at QPR. He liked to have those kind of players to call upon. So QPR fans have a pretty good memory of him as manager. He went on to Coventry and gave that up in the end, having just appointed Bobby Gould to work with him, because it was just becoming too much. He was still living around London, was commuting backwards and forwards to Coventry, suddenly found himself sort of almost daydreaming on the motorway and driving much too fast and getting stopped by the police. And at that point he said, this is getting silly. It's getting dangerous. So he left Coventry, ended up working with Chelsea for a while. And we're moving on a little bit now. It was 92. He worked with Chelsea again, had some health problems, which is why he kind of pulled back from that. But as I said earlier, he was happy to work. If someone said they wanted him to work with him, he would go and do it. He just liked to know that someone appreciated what he did, and he didn't necessarily always look at what club it was and what the setup was. If a manager came to him, especially if it's someone that he'd worked with before, like Terry Butcher at Coventry or whatever, he was happy to do it.
Yeah. Whilst he liked working alongside maybe the flamboyant type players who wanted to be coached as well, he never sort of forgot his defensive sort of history, in the fact that for England, in sort of consistently qualifying for tournaments, in all those qualifying games, goals conceded column was generally fairly low, and that was down to him.
Yeah, almost zero. I think I've mentioned in the book that after they failed to qualify for the 84 European Championships, their next 3 qualifying campaigns, they sort of won. They played 25 games, barely lost a game, and only conceded 3 goals in that period. They're certainly their success in qualifying was based on very solid defence. The interesting thing was, having qualified for the 1990 World Cup in Italy, there was a lot of discussion of whether the kind of defence they were playing, the sort of the traditional flat back 4, was actually going to carry them as far as they would want to go. I mean, they'd fallen at latish hurdles in the previous 2 World Cups. Don was aware that maybe they needed something a little bit more to carry them further. And there was a lot of discussion at that time that maybe England should be prepared to try something else and go to a sweeper system, if you like, with sort of 3 centre-backs and 2 full-backs pushing on to kind of create the width further forward. Don was quoted as supporting that. The press tried to build that up as a little bit of a conflict of ideas between him and Bobby Robson. Again, fortunately, the Robson-Howe relationship was close enough that didn't become an issue between them, that they respected each other's views enough that they could, certainly live with the fact that they might not see eye to eye on everything. But certainly the way that the 1990 World Cup worked out with that sort of sweeper system coming in had been something that had been brewing for a while, and appears to have stemmed from certainly from Don and maybe some others thinking that what we've done up to now is not necessarily going to give us the flexibility to move on and push on further.
Yeah, we're talking of sort of the players of that time were Mark Wright, Terry Butcher, Des Walker as sort of the 3 central defenders, and flanked by sort of Stuart Pearce and Paul Parker, of which Stuart Pearce he had a real effect on Don Howe. They worked well together.
Yeah, again, Stuart Pearson, another one of those people who says how influential Don was. He learnt a lot from Don. And again, I guess being another fullback, people like Viv Anderson, Gary Netherall said the same thing, that they learnt a lot about playing their position as well as playing within a defensive system. They also learnt a lot about their own sort of trade as a fullback as well from Don. And he was very good at passing his knowledge and his experience onto people. And you see how many of those people went on into kind of coaching themselves. That clearly they were getting something from him. So again, very influential on that 1990 World Cup, especially when you look at the way they did play at the back throughout the tournament.
Yeah, well, we got past Belgium and we got past Cameroon, just on both of those. But here's something I wasn't aware of. Apparently, it was Don Howe who gave the team talk ahead of the West Germany semi-final as Bobby Robson was having a nap.
Well, that's the story, and I think it's Paul Parker that relates that story. That Bobby was so tired and worn out and was feeling the pressure so much that when they got to the stadium for the semi-final, sort of Bobby Robson found a quiet corner and shut his eyes for a while. Interesting. Not the first time that Bobby had sort of, there'd been that kind of story around Bobby Robson in the '86 World Cup. I relate the story that Terry Neal told me that once they got to the quarterfinals and were heading off to Mexico, again Bobby was feeling the pressure. There was a lot of tension, and Don Howe said to Terry Neal that you're over here as a sort of a host and an ambassador. Can you take him out and get him drunk for a night, so kind of just to help ease the pressure? And I guess it was the same kind of thing, but Bobby Robson just shut his eyes for half an hour, decompressed a little bit, and Don gave the final sort of talk before the semi-final.
Oh, wonderful. Obviously, that we all know how that one went as well. But we exited the World Cup, which saw obviously Bobby Robson leave the position and go to the Netherlands for PSV, and in turn, Don Howe sort of left his position at England as Graham Taylor came in with his own staff, and sort of referring back to Bobby Robson sort of saying he couldn't believe that Don Howe hadn't got a contract at England and was only on, £200 a game. Graham Taylor had managed to get sort of Laurie McMenemy a full-time contract there with the FA. But that period of time for England, 92, I mean, with the greatest of respect, the players weren't of sort of maybe the 1990 calibre. Do you think Howe could have worked with Taylor? Or could he have worked with those players?
I think he could. Now, you're right in saying that maybe the quality of the players wasn't what they had in 1990 and what they would have again in 96. It certainly was a bit of a transition period for the England team. I think it's very difficult to imagine a scenario where Don Howe wouldn't have improved the performances that they had achieved under Graham Taylor. And now, without denigrating people like Laurie McMenemy and Phil Neal who worked with Graham Taylor, I mean, as we all know, there's that revealing documentary, about Graham Taylor's time as England manager, and certainly McMenemy and Neal, the contribution they appear to be making doesn't come out particularly favourably in that. So if that is all you have to go on, it's very difficult to think that Don Howe wouldn't have made a difference. And I think Don Howe was the kind of personality that he could have worked with pretty much everyone. He wasn't ever one of those coaches who managers suspected was trying to get their job. And especially by that time in his career, I think people knew that Don knew what he was good at, and he wasn't someone who, you had to be looking over your shoulder to see if they were about to stab you in the back. So I'm sure Don could have made a difference. I don't think it was something that he sort of necessarily hankered after. And when the discussion first came up of him potentially either taking over as a caretaker before they appointed Venables and then maybe working with Terry Venables, his first reaction was to say, look, I've done 10 years with the England team. I've done my stint. I'm very happy with what we've achieved, and I'm happy to leave it behind me. So I certainly don't think that he was sitting there watching Graham Taylor and McMenemy and everyone else and necessarily hankering after getting back in there again.
Yeah. Okay. When Graham Taylor resigned after the failure for 1994, his name was sort of bandied around as being a potential manager, but as you said, doesn't want it. But he is one of the ones that maybe suggests Terry Venables to the FA. Yeah,
I think Don knew what a good coach Venables had been. I think from an early period, as we mentioned earlier, the sort of kind of coaching courses that grew up in the sort of 50s and 60s and they were held at Lilleshall, and Don had ended up sort of guiding a lot of those courses, and Terry Venables had been one of the young players who, in the wake of sort of Malcolm Allison, but was like the next wave to come through, and so Don had seen and had experience of Terry Venables' knowledge of the game. He'd seen what he's achieved at various different clubs, and he sensed that he was, the right man for the job, and wasn't afraid to say so, and held no bitterness over the fact that when Don lost his job at Arsenal, part of the story around that time had been that they apparently had approached Terry Venables behind his back to take over, right, which Venables was unaware of. Venables was unaware of Don not being in the loop, if you like, and had apologised to Don at the time, said, look, I had no idea that this was being done without your knowledge, and ended up not taking the Arsenal job because he didn't necessarily like the way it had been done. So there was no hard feelings over that. He was happy to suggest in the media that Venables would be a good man for the job. And then, as it turned out, went back on what he'd said about, no, 10 years is enough, I don't want to work with England anymore. And was, when approached by Venables, again, that old thing, if someone wanted him to do the job and they said to him, this is what we want you to do, this is why we think you can help, Don was happy to put his tracksuit back on and get back out there on the training field.
And not only did Venables bring in Don Howe, he also brought back in Brian Robson, who at the time was still at Manchester United. It's kind of nice, those little sort of, you can tie those little ends up.
Yeah.
Obviously,
yeah.
The Brian Robson connection.
With all the expertise that Don had in sort of coaching defences over the years, this was the first time he had actually been appointed as a defensive coach, almost like the sort of the American football style defensive coordinator. That is specifically what Terry Venables brought him in to do. The idea was that Venables would work on sort of the front 5 or 6. Don Howe would concentrate on the defence, and Brian Robson would work on sort of more individual skill type things. And it seemed to work pretty well. Don Howe worked well with Venables in that Venables made it very clear from the start that he wanted his team to be flexible and not rigid. He wanted fluidity up front. Famously, he tried various different formations, the diamond formation and various other things in the way that he wanted his team to attack. But he also wanted flexibility at the back. And he basically got Don to work on his own version of that sort of back 3 with 2 wide men. Now, the big difference, as people probably know, is that whereas under Robson it was 3 centre-backs and then 2 full-backs providing the width, the way Venables wanted to do it was 1 centre-back flanked by 2 full-backs, and then you basically had 2 midfield players providing the width. And what that did was enable them to be a little bit more creative going forward. But then with that, you then needed a system where if a team was playing wingers, you needed to be able to go to a back 4. You pushed the fullbacks out to the normal fullback positions, and you then needed a central midfielder who could drop back and play as a centre-back. And, Don was very influential in making sure that flexible formation worked properly, that people understood their jobs. Someone like Tony Adams, who would be in the lone centre back in the middle of the two kind of notional fullbacks who were playing alongside him, understood where to position himself, how to kind of channel the play into certain areas so that system worked. And that was Don's job on the training field, to make sure that worked smoothly.
And it certainly paid off, as the first 4 games that England played under Terry Venables with Don Howe alongside him, 4 clean sheets.
Yeah, 4 clean sheets in the first 4 games. It's, I guess, a continuation of a pattern. And although you can't read everything into just looking at bare results, it certainly seems to be more than a coincidence that seems to be a pattern that kept repeating itself whenever Don became England coach.
Obviously, we all know how Euro 96 went, which was obviously great for the country and must have been great for Don as well.
Yeah, and I think he could see it coming. I had an interesting conversation with Darren Anderton, who said that he sat down people like him and Steve McManaman and some of the younger players a year out from Euro 96 and said to them, look, you've got a great experience coming up. He'd been to World Cup finals himself, seen what the excitement was when England got into late stages. He'd lived through the World Cup of 1966 in England and knew what it meant to the country. And I think he did a good job of impressing upon those players what a special time they had coming up, and that they should really embrace it, to the extent where Darren Anderton said that he actually turned down a transfer to Manchester United in the summer of 95 because his experience of when he'd moved from Portsmouth to Tottenham was that it kind of took him a year to kind of find his feet and get settled in and start playing his best football. He didn't want that to happen again with a potential move to Manchester United, find himself out of the England squad and miss out on all the excitement that Don Howe had been sort of telling them was to come their way. So, he was a good influence on some of the younger players. And during the tournament, they said that he was very good at just kind of keeping them calm. They knew that he was someone who'd sort of been there and seen it all and done it, and was someone they could go to for advice and a cool head, if you like, and just kind of help them keep all that excitement in check, because, it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience for them.
Absolutely. Yeah, I remember now reading the part about Darren Anderton and thinking that was an amazing story, and it makes you wonder whether that sort of scenario would happen in this day and age, even though we're only 30 years ago, I guess, 25 years ago. But I guess you only find out in 25 years' time when the stories actually come out, whether it would be a similar situation.
I suspect it wouldn't. I suspect a move to a big club that was going to offer you a lot of money probably would be enough to sway it for most players these days. But we would think.
Yeah, I imagine so. Glenn Hoddle then was in the next England manager after Terry Venables departed after Euro 96 and decided that he didn't need Don Howe as part of his England team. And Don was happy with that, which is sort of very sort of as you would expect him to be.
Yeah. Glenn said, Glenn told him that he didn't necessarily see a role for him. And Don Howe wasn't going to push it. He said, look, if you don't want me, you don't think there's a role, fine. I'm not going to try and persuade you.
And with sort of Glenn's answer to that and Don's answer as well, he went back to Arsenal once again, but this time to work with the youth team alongside Liam Brady, who he'd been with back in the late 70s, early 80s, wasn't it? And between them, they brought through the likes of Ashley Cole.
Yeah, Brady had been appointed to head up Arsenal's sort of academy and youth team in, I think it was 96, asked Don if he was interested in working with him. Don initially said no, and then I think a year later got on the phone to Liam and said, you know what, is that job still open? I think I quite fancy it. Again, to a lot of people, it would seem like a sort of come down. Here you've got a guy who's coached England to the latter stages of major finals, and he's going to go back and coach a youth team. But I think a couple of things. Obviously, the fact that it was Arsenal made a big difference. The fact that it was Liam Brady, someone who he had obviously worked with and coached and had a huge admiration for and a lot of time for, who was asking him, that certainly made a difference. And I think by that time he just wanted to get out working again. And, you know, a lot of people sort of said, Don Howe, you couldn't have got a better youth team coach. You know, so often the youth team coach is someone who's sort of trying to make their way in football and make their way in their coaching career, and they might be young and slightly inexperienced. Well, who better could you have coaching your kids than someone who'd done everything that Don Howe had done? So I think Liam Brady was, you know, thrilled to get him on board. And then, yeah, I think what Don and Liam did, in a sense, was kind of solve that conundrum of, is your major task to produce players for the first team, or is it to win trophies? And you know, they managed to do both, really. They won a couple of FA Youth Cups, sent a lot of players through to good football careers, you know, including, as you said, Ashley Cole and quite a few other players. So I think, you know, Don enjoyed that role for a long period of time. Eventually gave it up when he decided that, you know what, the new breed of players are starting to become, I think they know a little bit more than they do, and maybe, you know, it's time for me to step back and enjoy retirement. And, you know, after all the years he put in to football, I don't think anyone could begrudge him that.
Absolutely not, no. And one other thing that I picked up on, much like he had recommended sort of Terry Venables to the FA, he was approached by the Irish FA, the FIA, and he had input into Giovanni Trapattoni becoming manager there. So, I mean, it's not just sort of England based, really, is it? He had a sort of a worldwide knowledge.
Yeah, I think he did. He definitely did have a worldwide knowledge, you know, and a worldwide reputation. And, you know, people wanted his advice and his knowledge, whether it was the Irish FA asking him to help them appoint a new manager, or it was Channel 4 getting him to work on their Italian football coverage. And through that, you know, George Graham asking him to get advice on some of the Italian teams that Arsenal ended up playing in Europe. You know, there was a lot of people who realised that, you know, Don Howe had a lot to offer in various different areas.
Sadly, though, he was to pass away on the 23rd of December 2015, shortly before Christmas. He was aged 80 and had shown signs of dementia in the years that he approached that age. But from across football, the tributes poured in all over for him, which sums him up. I mean, what do you think he still has a legacy in the game to this day, I'm sure?
I think he does. I mean, I think, you know, you look at the people that thought so much of him and said, you know, such great things about him, and you look at the roles they have in the game, whether it was, you know, as we mentioned earlier, Brian Robson and you know, who at the time of Don's death was still coaching, or it's a Gary Lineker, you know, telling everyone who kind of follows him what a great coach Don was. You know, you hope that even with the passing of time, that legacy will remain, and that people will remember everything that Don did for a number of clubs, and, you know, more generally for English football. You know, it would be a shame if that is lost. And again, you know, without sort of, you know, trying to sound too trite, that's what was one of the motivations for writing a book like that. You hope that it does sort of memorialise what someone has done for football and, you know, what their legacy is.
Well, it's a great book. I really enjoyed reading it. It's educated me. It's the story of Don Howe, English football's greatest coach. It's got a subtitle, Hero in the Shadows, which was a term coined by Arsenal's Daily Canon website at the time of his death, which I think is quite a phrase. Hero in the Shadows. He's all always been there, but not wanting to take that limelight. David, thank you very much for your time.
Absolute pleasure.
What else are you looking at the moment? Who are you writing about?
I'm working on a couple of cricket projects now. I've done a few cricket books in the past, but I've had a sort of a streak of football books. So I'm back on cricket for a while, and but I'm sure I'll be returning to football at some point.
Look forward to that, and I must also say thank you very much to the guys at Pitch Publishing, where you can pick up the book there. David, once again, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
My many thanks go to David there for his time. His book is called Don Howe, A Hero in the Shadows. It is published by Pitch Publishing and available from their website and in all good bookshops. This has been another in our England Manager series. And whilst Don wasn't an England manager, I'm sure you'll appreciate just the contribution he made to our national side and those he worked alongside. As I mentioned at the beginning, I've been researching Graham Taylor, and I hope to bring you that episode soon. All the previous England Manager episodes, they can be found at your podcast provider if you've missed any, and indeed all the other ones too. Thanks as always for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. Don't forget you can follow the podcast on social media. Just search Three Lions Podcast. You can find it on the likes of Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and you can also find it on YouTube too. Just feel free to like, subscribe, and all that jazz. So until the next time, take care of yourself. Cheers.